Hey, Hammy here. First video to start chapter 3. In this chapter we're going to take a look at cells and their structure, the parts that make up the cell, and also some of their functions, how cells in living organisms, some of their jobs that they do, some of the things that are important in the life of a cell. So this first video here will kind of kick off kind of the discovery of cells and the cell theory. Okay, when we look back in the history of cells, we see that as early as the 1600s, okay, mid-1600s, there was a British scientist by the name of Robert Hooke who really took a fascination with lenses and seeing things that our naked eye can't see. So Robert Hooke looked at just tons of stuff underneath the microscope, a lot of living things. He actually published a book called Microscopes, okay, of the physical descriptions of minute bodies made by magnifying glasses with observations and inquiries thereupon. So some kind of fancy English there for you. In other words, it was just a book of all these drawings, and the one thing he looked at was cork. Cork comes from underneath the bark of a tree, and I don't know if he took like a wine bottle and just made a thin cutting of it, but when he looked at cork underneath the microscope, okay, this is his drawing of cork here, he noticed that there were like rows and rows and rows and rows of what looked like cells in a monastery. Okay, so long hallways with rooms off of each hallway, and he said, man, those look like cells of a monastery. So he is kind of credited as early as 1665 with using the term cell to refer to these little structures that you find inside of living things. Now, Hooke's book became very popular. People became very interested. If you look over the next couple decades, over the next 100 years, people really became fascinated with all this stuff that our eye can't see. There's like a whole new world there. And so microscopes became very popular for people to buy and look at different things. The next guy we want to talk about, 1674, Anton van Leeuwenhoek, who is from Holland. He either couldn't afford or didn't like the microscopes that you could buy that day, so he developed his own. Okay, so his homemade microscope, there's kind of a picture of it down here, looks sort of like a paddle with some screws on it, and you'd put your specimen up here. And he developed his own kind of microscope, and he got these lenses from an Italian lens maker that were ground really smooth and had really good focal points on them. And he began looking like at many things. And this microscope was one of the first to get over 200x magnification. So he began to see really tiny things. And when he looked at, he just looked at everything. The local well, he'd do teeth, scrapings off of his teeth, and he noticed these things, these little microorganisms swimming around. Okay, so here's some drawings of kind of what he coined animalcules. So they were like as small as molecules, but they were swimming around and moving like animals. So he said, tiny animals, molecules, animals, we'll call them animalcules. So kind of a clever name that he called these little cells swimming around. And one time, he actually had diarrhea, and he wondered why. So I know this is really gross, but he made a little smear of his diarrhea on a slide, and he saw these little things that look like this swimming around, and he was like, what in the world? He was actually looking at Gerardia lamblia, which is oftentimes you get an infection by drinking water that's not purified or sterilized, like out of a stream or something like that, and it was in his intestines and giving him the diarrhea. So he actually looked at his own poo, which is really gross, but man, true heart of the scientist right there. And so he sort of like cork is just kind of dead, empty cells. Leeuwenhoek opened up this world of all these living, moving little creatures that our eyes can't see. Fast forward about another 100 years to the 1830s, kind of in the mid-1830s, there were two scientists from Germany, Teddy Schwann and Matthew Schleiden, that actually worked in different areas. Okay, Schleiden was a botanist. Okay, a botanist would work with plants, and in his study of plants, he noticed, and these are kind of some of his drawings here. He noticed that, man, there were these little tiny cells. Whether you looked at leaves, stems, roots, flowers, seeds, he always saw these cells, and it made him think, all plants are, are all plants made of cells? And the more plants he looked at, the more that he thought that was true. And he sent a letter to somebody at a different university in Germany, Teddy Schwann, who did a lot of, looking at tissues. And these are some of the cells here. And he said, well, I'm noticing the same thing. I look at muscle, I see cells. I look at something's liver, I see cells. And so they kind of commuted back and forth and came up with this sort of idea that, hey, all animals, all plants, everything's made up of these little units that Robert Hooke called cells a couple 100 years ago. And they're like, maybe all living things are made up of cells. A little later than that, there was a German doctor by the name of Rudolf Virchow. This is him over here. Was studying cells underneath the microscope when he observed something. Okay, he saw a cell actually divide into two. Okay, slowly dividing into two new cells and growing. And he said, this really made him think there was this idea of spontaneous generation at the time, where living things could kind of arise spontaneously from non-living stuff. And Virchow said, well, I think I see cells kind of pulling apart, dividing up, and dividing themselves into two. And so where do cells come from? He proposed that all cells come from other living cells. Okay, cells arise from other living cells. Okay, kind of all these ideas together are what we call the cell theory now today. Okay, the cell theory has three main parts, so you need to write this down in your notes. Number one, kind of along the lines of Schleiden and Schwann, they said all organisms are made up of one or more cells. So there are some microorganisms, like some bacteria and protists, that are just one cell is the organism. And there's also like us who are made up of like trillions of cells. Okay, so all things, if you're living, you're made up of cells. Number two, all life functions of organisms occur within cells. Sometimes you'll see that cells make up the structure and function of living things. So we are made up of cells, as well as everything, all our metabolic processes, digestion, nerve impulses, muscle contractions for movement. That is all done through different cells throughout our body, and in plants and in fungi and all living things. And number three, Rudolf Virchow said all cells come from already existing cells. So they give rise, life gives rise to life, life comes from other cells. And so if we look at kind of levels of organization over here, you see atoms are put together to make molecules. Molecules make macromolecules, which we studied last chapter, lipids, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, and which one am I missing? Lipids, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, and proteins. Proteins, okay, those put together make up the cell. That's the smallest basic unit of a living thing. Okay, has to be a cell to be considered living. Cells then are put together to form different tissues. epithelial tissue, covering tissue, muscle tissue, nervous tissue, okay, that have specific functions. You combine different tissues together, you'll get an organ. For example, here, epithelial tissue is put together to make a lung with other kinds of tissue. You put the lungs together, different organs, that's an organ. You put different organs together like the lungs, the trachea, your nose, nasal cavity, mouth. That all makes up an organ system, or the respiratory system. You put all the systems together: respiratory system, digestive system, nervous system, lymphatic system, muscular system, skeletal system. Those things all then make the organism. So these things, some cells live on their own, but in multicellular organisms, we're 76 trillion cells or something like that. Those cells all work together in tandem in tissues to make organs and organ systems, and all that stuff is working together to make this finely tuned organism. Not just animals, but also in fungi and in plants. Plants have different organs and tissues and organ systems as well to make the organism. So that's kind of the basic hierarchy of life. So that's kind of some of the main scientists that lead up to this cell theory, and kind of this idea that we are made up of cells, and then it's kind of built up from there. The complexity is built up from there.